Okay, so good morning, and we begin our third shiur on Shmitta. It's the third shiur on Shmitta, and we are still discussing the question of the status of Shmitta in our times, in the time after Korban Beit HaMikdash on one hand, but as we are returning, Baruch Hashem, to Eretz Israel on the other hand, and we have first to understand what is to analyze what is the general status of Shmitta in our times before we can go down to the details of how to operate in our gardens, or what fruits can we buy, should we buy, what should we do with the fruits, etc., etc., etc. Many of these topics depend on the question of is Shmitta in our times still a biblical mitzvah, a mitzvah deoraita, or is it only a rabbinical concept as of current times? Now, I would make a very short rehash on why should we think that it's only a mitzvah derabanan. After all, it is recorded in the Torah as a mitzvah, right? More than once. So why would anyone think that this mitzvah only applies derabanan in our times? And the answer to that is that we have threefold reasons. Why should we think that Shmitta does not apply midoraita in our times? And we do it very shortly. If someone wants, then we have the recording. I posted the recording of last week, and then you can hear all hour about this question. Now we'll do it, Be'ezrat Hashem, I hope in less than 5 minutes. So the first reason is maybe the sanctification of the ground, of the mud, right, of the land itself, is lost when we were exiled from the land. And that's a very interesting question relating to what is sanctifying the land of Israel. Is it being sanctified by conquering? Is it being sanctified by settling? And what can desanctify the land? So these were the questions that we were dealing with. We saw that there is an opinion. There is, in fact, an opinion that says that while the land is still holy, it is not sanctified. I hope that these terms makes any sense in English. But it's meaning it's still dear to God, if we can say that. It's holy in that sense, but in the actual sense of sanctification, it has lost its status as sanctified, and it still waits for Mashiach to come and re-sanctify the land. And that is the opinion of some of the poskim. And according to that, if the land is not sanctified, then also the mitzvah of Shmitta would not apply. Now, while this is an opinion held by some poskim, this is not the mainstream. The mainstream opinion is that the land was sanctified in the time of Ezra. It was first sanctified in the time of Yoshua. But this sanctification was lost when Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the first Jewish kingdom. And then the land was re-sanctified by Ezra and Nehemiah when they came to the land 70 years after the first destruction. And this sanctification was never lost, and it still lasts to our day. So that's the mainstream opinion. Second point that is debated, even if we say that the land is sanctified, it may be that there is an additional condition in order for Shmitta to apply midoraita, and this condition is that we need the majority of the Jewish people to live here in the land in order for certain mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz that depends on the land, in order for them to apply. Why? Because certain mitzvot only depend on the actual sanctification of the ground. That's what we spoke earlier. So, for example, Orla may be a mitzvah that only has to do with the land is sanctified, so what is growing in this land is sanctified, so we need to wait 3 years before we eat. But other mitzvot, while they only can be kept in Eretz Israel, it's not enough for them to be in Eretz Israel, but there is also a condition, as we said, and that is that the social construction, we may say, would exist. Because they do not only depend on the land, they also depend on the state. So that's an additional level, a second, we may say, a second store, right, of the same concept. And here there is a question: do we have the majority of the Jewish people right now in Eretz Israel? Even when we will have, maybe in the next few years, then would we know that we have the majority? Because who knows how many Jews really are out there? Many do not know by themselves that they are Jews. On the other hand, people that identify themselves as Jews may be, for our purposes, completely non-Jewish. So it is very difficult to give any assessment which should be accurate on this question. So that's a second problem. And here many poskim believe that it is correct that nowadays, as we do not have, or seemingly we do not have, the majority of Jewish people still living in the land of Israel, that's why Shmitta would not apply, because Shmitta does not only depend on the real sanctification of the ground, but also on a Jewish state, and a whole Jewish state requires the residing of at least the majority of the Jewish people in Eretz Israel. So that's a second point of debate. A third point of debate is, even if we will hold that we do have the majority of the Jewish people here in Eretz Israel, and that may be the situation 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, there is another question. Shmitta is also related, it's part of an even more general structure of Yovel, meaning we count 7 years, and then there is a Shmitta in the end of every cycle of 7 years. And then after 7 Shmittot, after 7 sabbatical years, we have what we call the Jabali, the Yovel, which is once every 50 years. Now, what happens in Shnata Yovel? In Shnata Yovel, everyone is supposed to return to his original land. So if, let's say, I'm from a certain Shevet, a certain tribe, let's say I'm from Asher, I have no idea what tribe am I, but let's imagine that I'm from Asher. So Asher received a certain portion of the land. And I need not only to know what is my tribe, but also what is my father house, the Beit Av, right? That back then when they entered into the land. And then I need to be able to identify what portion in the share of Asher my own family received. That's it. Now we are obviously far light years from this type of information. And because of that, we cannot enact the Shnata Yovel. Now, because we cannot enact the Shnata Yovel, many say, then we also cannot enact the Shnata Shmitta, because it is all part of the same system. So now we speak not only about the ground, the sanctification of the ground, even not only about the state, the society, the Jewish society, but we speak about the ability to acknowledge that everything belongs to God. You remember that was the third concept of the Shmitta, and that can only be achieved via the Shnata Yovel. So if we are unable to apply the Shnata Yovel, then the Shmitta cannot be, cannot apply as well. So that's basically the third reason why many hold that we do not have Shmitta Deoraita nowadays. So that's as a quick rehearse, which took me 7 minutes, or almost 10, and not 5 as I hoped. But okay, but that's what we have. So that is what we spoke about last week. Because of what we just said, the majority opinion of the poskim is that Shmitta nowadays is only a derabbanan. It's a rabbin now. When we say only a rabbanan, Chas v'chayla, we do not mean to say that we can be light-headed regarding mitzvah derabbanan. Almost everything that we do during the day is a mitzvah derabbanan, right? For example, I'm sure that no one of us would ever dream about, let's say, cooking milk in a fleshik pot. But almost always, cooking milk in a fleshik pot, if it was not used for meat in the last 24 hours, it would only be a derabbanan, for example. Or even eating, let's say, taking a chicken and cooking it in milk. That is only a derabbanan. But again, no one of us would ever dream to be any lightheaded regarding that. And in the same way, when we say that Shmitta is only a Rabbanan, it's not only Chas v'Chayila, it's not in order to say Chas v'Chayila that we should be mezalzel and that we should not regard completely respectfully mitzvot the Rabbanan. What we mean to say is that sometimes when you have concepts, mitzvot, that are the Rabbanan, you can have more leniencies, rabbinical leniencies, in certain situation or regarding certain doubts, or when you have disputes in halacha, you can be more lenient when we speak about the Rabbanan. And that's why it is often extremely important to make this decision or to make this call that Shmitta nowadays is the Rabbanan, because it has many implications, is this the word? Repercussions. It has many repercussions down the road. So that's an important point. It is not completely agreed upon, but it seems to be the mainstream opinion, and that's the assumption that we are going to work with. What I'm going to do today is to try and make this statement that Shmitta nowadays is the Rabbanan a little more, I would like to a little more detail it out. So it wouldn't be just some blunt expression, it's a Rabbanan, but to understand the Rabbanan from when, from where, and for what purposes is the Shmitta the Rabbanan. And here we have different opinions. One opinion is the opinion of Baal HaMaor and the Raavad. Baal HaMaor and the Raavad, and you would find it in the first source in this page, they held that because we do not have Yovel, then we cannot count the years. There is no counting of years. And if there is no counting of years, oh Hashem, the voice of children playing in Eretz Israel, that's something that is a blessing. So we should, it's a fulfillment of a nevuah, as you know, about children that would one day play in Yerushalayim, but okay, fine, Talmud is also fine. And so hearing that is not less good. I hope that for Zoom participants, hopefully because of the microphone, they are not supposed to be too much bothered by that. Anyhow, returning to our page. So the Rabbinical and Baal HaMaor held that Kevan Shebata La Yovel Bitul Gamur, because there is no Yovel anymore, Af Shmitta Eina Noheget Klal, then there is no Shmitta whatsoever. Why? Because as we said, because Shmitta is part of a larger structure, a larger construction of the Yovel, and if one of the parts is missing, then the whole thing is falling down. So imagine, just for example, let's imagine that we would not had Pesach. I don't know why and how such a thing can happen. But let's say that Pesach would somehow would not be able to enact it. Then we would not be able to begin the Sfirat HaOmer. If you would not be able to begin the Sfirat HaOmer, then also Shavuot would fall down. Right? So that's what happens with Shmitta and Yovel. Because you don't have the Yovel, then your whole ability to count is failing, and then you do not have Shmitta. That's the opinion of Baal HaMaor and the Raavad. Here it's quoted by the Ramban. So we speak, these are sages from the 12th and the 13th century. And he quotes their opinion, and he says, Ve'ein ze mechuvar. I'm in the middle line here. Ein ze mechuvar. Ein ze mechuvar. So Ramban notes on this opinion of Rabbi Avraham ben David and Baal HaMaor, both provincial sages from south of France. He says, their opinion is unclear to me. Ein ze mechuvar. Ve'araya machrat. How do I prove that they are wrong? I mean that there is Shmitta in our times. Sheshnat Shmitta mefursemet be'eretz Yisrael. Ramban says, no, Ramban himself made an aliyah after the famous dispute of Barcelona in which he won against the Christians. So that's what happens when you win a war that you are not supposed to win. Then he had to run for his life because you are not supposed to win against the church. So his good fortune was that the king, while being also extremely Christian, he was a decent man, and he acknowledged the Ramban's victory in the dispute. He gave him a monetary prize in order to compensate him for his victory, and then he said, "You'd better get away from here." And Ramban said, if I'm already living in Spain, where I was born, then why wouldn't I go to Eretz Israel? I should live in Eretz Israel, and that's what Ramban in a very old age is going to the land of Israel. And he says, I have been there, and I can tell you, they keep Shmitta. Don't tell me that there is no Shmitta in our times, because I was there, and there is. Yeah, and there is. שנת השמיטה מפורסמת בארץ ישראל, so it's something that is well known in the land of Israel. ומנהג אבותיהם בידיהם, it's not something they made up now, that is something that they have for generations. להשמיט קרקע, כלומר שנוהגים בה כל קדושת שביט, so they do all the laws of שביט. Don't tell me there's no שביט nowadays. What would be the response of Rabbi Avraham ben David at Baal HaMaor? We do not know, because they were before the Ramban, and they were already not, they were not around when Ramban wrote these lines. But we have one of their, we may say, spiritual descendants, which is Rabbeinu Menachem HaMeiri. So Rabbeinu Menachem HaMeiri was also from Provence, but he lived after the Ramban. So that's the 40th century. And he response in the name of the tradition is coming from to the Ramban's critique. He says, on one hand, we hold that on analytical grounds, there should be no Shmitta nowadays, because we do not count the years. On the other hand, you testify, and obviously we accept your testimony, that there is Shmitta in Eretz Israel. So how do we reconcile the analytical assumption that we have with just the facts on the ground? Says the Meiri, ממה שראו שהיו נוהגים דין שביעית אף בעבודת קרקע. So they saw, we can see that they do have the minhag of Shmitta, דין שביעית, the law of the seventh year, even speaking about the working of the land. And he gives also an example from the Gemara. Alma, we can see from here, I'm in source bet, excuse me, Alma, שנוהגת הייתה אף Alma שנוהגת הייתה אף לאחר החורבן. So you're right, we can see that Shmitta also was being kept and observed after the destruction. אלא שלדעתנו, if you ask me, if you ask the tradition I am coming from, so why do they keep the Shmitta? זו מידת חסידות ולזכר בעלמא. It's a nice minhag they have. It's a midat chasidut. Midat chasidut means that's a piety, right? That's something that they do because they are great tzaddikim in Eretz Israel, and obviously it's beautiful, and they do it in order to remember. It's a zecher, like zecher lachurban. So it's a way to remember the destruction. It's a way to remember the destruction, but says the Meiri, that is not a binding derabanan ruling. It's a minhag. Now we have to remember, minhagim are very important to the Jewish people, right? So that is not something, again, that is not something to be lightheaded about. It's another thing not to be lightheaded about. I spoke about the derabanan, but even minhagim, we have many minhagim. Again, it may be that, I don't know, I never made a check, but I would guess that at least 40 or 50% of what we do religiously, our religiously acts during the weekdays or the Shabbat are minhagim, right? They are not necessarily the Rabbanan. Look at our tefillah, for example. So parts of the tefillah, it may be, it's a machloek, it may be that the basic obligation to daven is the right. Obviously, the whole structure is the Rabbanan. The words were written by Chachamim, but most of the tefillah is not even that. It's a minhag. Who decided what exactly would be said, for example, in the Psukei Dezim, right, in the first part of the tefillah? Well, it's not a mitzvah, the Rabbanan. It's not that there was a court sitting and making a decision. The people wanted to have a Psukei Dezim, wanted to say some praise to God before tefillah, and there were certain Pirkei Teilim that got in. That's why there are so big differences between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. That's because if you look at the Shmona Esrei is much more similar. There are still small difference in wordings, but the order of the brachot and the content of the brachot are all the same. Why? Because that's the Rabbanan. But Psukei Dezimra, you have completely different sometimes psalms, and the order can be completely different between Ashkenaz and Sfat. That's not a problem, because the whole thing is a minhag. So we have different minhagim which are very important for us. Now, would I say that you should skip Sukkot de Zimra? Chas v'chalila, all right? So saying it's a minhag doesn't mean that we should be lightheaded about that, but obviously, when it would come with a conflict with other values, then we would have to think, right, what should take precedence, the minhag or maybe other values or other mitzvot that should be. So, for example, if someone is late to tefillah, and he can either make it to tefillah b'minyan for the Shemona Esrei, or say the Psukei de Zimra, then we'll tell him, you should shorten your Psukei de Zimra to the minimum that you can, and immediately skip the Psukei de Zimra, and immediately skip to the Shemona Esrei in order to have tefillah b'minyan, which is of a large, more important, it's a more important mitzvah because that's a real derabban. So when it comes into conflict, then obviously we'd have to make a call about what is more important. So all of that was the first opinion that we wanted to see, and that is that Shmitta nowadays is a minhag. Minhag is something important, but if we take this ladder of importance, then obviously that would be on the bottom end of the spectrum. Okay. A different opinion is by the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchot Shmitta v'Yovel, Perek Yud Halacha Tet, in the third source, and now there are differences of versions here. So I am giving you the version which is accepted nowadays as the official version that we find in the manuscripts, but it is not completely clear that is the correct version, so we would have just to rely on what we have here. So the Rambam says, בזמן שהיובל נוהג דין עבד עברי, ודין בתי ערי חומה, ודין שדה חרמים, ודין שדה אחוזה, ומקבלים גר תושב, ונוהגת שביעית בארץ, והשמטת כספים בכל מקום מן התורה. Says Rambam. The Yovel doesn't stand only to itself, but that's the foundation, we may say, of many other mitzvot that depend on the Yovel, and he has here a whole list. So, for example, the laws of the Jewish slave. I don't know if we are so expecting when Baruch Hashem would be able to get back the laws of Jewish slave, but if you would like to do that, then you should know that when we have Yovel, we can also have the return of the Jewish slave. And Din Batei Arei Choma, that is the law of Arei Choma, that when you sell a house in a gated city, then the seller has a year to redeem his house. So you bought a house, you got in, wait with the renovations, because during the first year, he is allowed to go back and redeem the house. So that's another law that would only be enacted after the Yovel would come back. And I mean, we can go into each law here. We don't have the time. What is important for us, that part of the list, is Shmitta. Noeget Shvit Ba'aretz, right? So Shmitta can only be valid when there is a Yovel, says Rambam. Ubizman she'en haYovel noeg, but when we do not have the Yovel, what happens then? So when there is no Yovel, says Rambam, ein noeg din eved ivri, there is no Jewish slave, I'm sorry, you have to do the work yourself. Velo batei arei choma, if you bought a house, or if you sold a house, let's say that you're the seller, then that's it. You sold it, you lost it, ולא שדה אחוזה, ולא שדה חרמים, ואין מקבלים גר תושב, so we do not have the law of the residing alien, which is an important law for our political state right now, but that's another story. ונוהגת שביעית בארץ מדבריהם. It says Shmitta is not completely lost. I do not agree, says Rambam, he didn't know them because he was before them, but I do not agree with the Baal HaMaor and the Raived and the Meiri, all these provincial, am I allowed to say provincial? Is that a derogatory term? But they came from Provence, so how would you say that? You can, those people, yeah, you cannot say provincial. Okay, so the people from Provence, he says, I do not agree with their position. Yeah, so no, they were not simply, they just come from this place calling Provence. So he says, Rambam says I do not accept their position that there is no Shmitta nowadays. It's only a Minhag. No, that is not correct. Chachamim sat down and decided that while we do give up on the Jewish slave and we do give up on the time to turn around and to take back your house, we do not give up on the Shmitta. And although we lost its deoraita validity, we impose it by our rabbinical authority. So that would be a mitzvah derabanan. It's not only a memory, a minhag in memory of the mikdash, but it's a mitzvah derabanan. Why? Because there is a value to it nowadays as well. Why? Because there is a value in understanding that I do not own the land. There is a value in understanding that I need to have a more equalitarian society in which people are allowed to come. All the different reasons, because we want to give people the sabbatical year so they will be able to learn some Torah, or to develop their spirituality. Be it as it may, Chachamim saw value, as in many other mitzvot. They saw value in us still keeping mitzvot, even mitzvot that lost their deoraita value after the destruction. Chachamim thought that would be still good and wise to keep them, so they made them into a derabanan. All right, so as we do Sefirat HaOmer, for example. All right, so there is no Beit HaMikdash, we still do Sefirat HaOmer. That may be only in memory of Beit HaMikdash, but maybe yes, maybe not. It's difficult to, the Sugya is not clear about that. That's, and again, a whole additional shiur. But or lulav, many other mitzvot that back at the time were a mitzvah deoraita, when there was a Beit HaMikdash, Trumot u'Masrot. But nowadays, they are only the Rabbanan, because Chachamim still saw value in us keeping these mitzvot. Okay, so that's the opinion of Rambam. So you can see the differences here, all right? So we have, again, the Baal HaMaor and the Raavad and the Meiri holding it's only a minhag, a good minhag, a beautiful minhag, a minhag that we should keep, but a minhag. And now we have the Rambam saying, no, it's not only a minhag, it's a mitzvah derabanan, a real mitzvah derabanan. An interesting differentiation maybe between these two opinions is regarding the question that I mentioned last week. And that is the mention, as you may remember, the Torah addresses a specific concern that we may have. We may ask the question, what would we eat if we do not work the land in the 7th year? What would we eat in the 7th and in the 8th year? Because there would also be nothing, if we would not plant during the 7th year, there would be nothing to harvest in the 8th year. So what are we going to eat? And the Torah says explicitly, do not worry, I, being God, would bless the land in the 6th year, and it would give enough fruits for both the 7th and the 8th year. That's the Torah states. So we have a promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we can keep the Shmitta and everything will be fine, will be good. Okay, great. What happens if there is no Shmitta Deoraita anymore? Can we still count on this blessing? Now, that may be an important factor. When we decide how much can we be stringent regarding the Shmitta, if I know that I have the backup of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then I can allow myself, obviously, to be more stringent. Because I say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he promised he would take care. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, I am taking care when you do my comments. If you want to do your own things, then that's beautiful. That's part of what the Torah, everything is fine, but, make your own fruits then. Make your own blessings. So can we now, and then we'd have to recalibrate ourselves. We'd have to readjust to the situation in which we don't have this promise. And maybe we'd have to introduce certain leniencies in order for the thing to work, for people to have food. So here, there is, as you can guess, there is a dispute regarding what would HaKadosh Baruch Hu supposed to do. Is he supposed to give us the bracha or not? And that's, by the way, part of, I think, of the beauty of our tradition, of our Torah. Meaning, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu, obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can do whatever he pleases, right? But if he wrote something in the Torah, everything that is written in the Torah was given, it's not lo b'shamayim, it's not in heaven. What was given to us, we are allowed to ponder and to make decisions, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is supposed, at least, to follow. That's what I'm saying is it may sound ridiculous, but I think that's the Jewish position. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is supposed to cooperate with our interpretation. I mean, our is not mine. Our, I mean, the sages' interpretation of the Torah. And for example, one example that is being brought in already in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi says when we do a leap year, a Shana Meuberet, we add a month, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, there are certain halachot that depends, let's say, on the boy being 13, right, or the girl being 12 or 3 years old. So when we do leap years, that means that we are lengthening the year or shortening it. So we are changing the age, right, of the boy or the girl. So HaKadosh says, okay, so I would, according to the Yerushalmi, HaKadosh says, I would change the development of the boy or the girl according to your leap year. I accept, meaning he says, because I gave this, that's an authority. I gave the earthly court, so the heavenly court would follow suit. And the same would go to the bracha. If HaKadosh Baruch would keep the bracha meaning to his own decision, then obviously we do not have the right to infringe. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu writes it down in the Torah, then he makes it our business to interpret this bracha. And so it's now up to the Chachamim to decide what is the right interpretation. Would the bracha still apply if the mitzvah is not a deoraita?
Nowadays, like maybe what they thought on that day, what you think is enough food to survive, like Hashem says a provider, but we think is provided.
Yeah, so we would speak about that in Yirtzeh Hashem also. That would be a topic for Hashem, a future shiur. But we would speak about the question. Meaning, when we speak about Shmitta, there are a few questions that needs to be asked. There's one question: is would we have cucumbers? Okay, and that can be pretty not easily, but that can be solved. That's not the most difficult question. The difficult question is: would there be agriculture in Israel in the year after the Shmitta? That's the real problem. Is not would we have cucumbers on the 7th year, but would we have farmers on the Jewish farmers on the 8th year? That's a question that is not so easy to answer, and there are different, even though there are different opinions about what would be the impact if we would really enact a real Shmitta, until everyone just hands off the ground and let's return next year. What would happen to our contracts with exports? So all of this is up in the air. No one really knows. We never tried, and obviously that's a gamble to take. But that's part of the question. If we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I am backing your game, that's not a gamble anymore. That's winning. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the end of the story. But if there is not such a promise, then obviously we need to be very careful. We need to be prudent. We speak about the livelihood of people. That's not an easy question. That's the parnasa of many people. Okay. So that's a machloket. That's a dispute between the poskim. Would the Kadosh Baruch Hu give his bracha even when the Shmitta is only a derabbanan? So if you look at source Daled, that's from the Sma, Sefer Meirat Enaim. That's Rabbi Yeshua Falk writing in Europe. I think in the 17th century. I forget. I apologize. I think it was in the 17th century, but I may be wrong in that. And he writes, דווקא בזמן שהיה שמיטה ויובל נוהג מן התורה, הייתה מקוימת בהן הברכה לגדל בשנה שישית ל3 שנים. So it says, only when it was a mitzvah deoraita, then the bracha applied for the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th year. But if there is no Shmitta min Torah, as in our times, according to the mainstream opinion, then there is also no bracha. Point, period. Right? That's the opinion of the Sefer Meirat Enaim. A similar route is being taken by Rav Kook here in source Hay, in one of his letters to the Radvaz, that was the rabbi of Tzfat in the time. He writes to him, בעוונותינו הרבים, by our sins, הנס הגלוי של וציוויתי ברכתי, meaning the miracle that should have happened, that God would command, that God would give us his blessing. אין אנחנו ראויים עדיין שיתגלה בפועל. We do not deserve that it would be realized מפני כמה סיבות, for a few reasons. או מפני נפילת הדור. One says the generation is not, we are not deserving. We do not deserve this to happen, which is a sad analysis, but what can we do? What can you say? או מפני הספקות בעניין גוף השמיטה. Also, we are not sure. Is Shmitta really applied? Doesn't it apply? So all of these are doubts. ועל פי דרך הטבע, and according to nature, if you cannot rely on miracle, then we need to resort to nature. So we need to make sure that on what is called rational grounds, we can stand. Then we need to find some leniency, at least to some issues of Sheimtta. And that is, as you may know, that is his introduction to the leniency of Heter Mechira. So that's, everyone knows that Heter Mechira is not something that we aspire to, right? That's not what we hope. That's not how Shmitta should look like. But, the famous joke about when they discovered that smoking is bad for your health. So in every shul, they stand up, or in every religious institution of other religions, and you're not allowed to smoke, you shouldn't smoke. And in the shul, the rabbi stands up and he says, you need to sell your lungs to a non-Jew. Okay, so we all understand that selling the land to a non-Jew in order to allow, and I'm oversimplifying, we'd speak about the Heter Mechira at length, but that's not what the Torah imagined when it spoke about Shmitta. That's not what we aspire to, selling the land to non-Jews, a part of all the problems involved in selling land in Eretz Israel to non-Jews. So that's, but he says we have no other choice. If we could have relied on the blessing, then that would have been beautiful, but we cannot rely on that. So we need to be practical. We need to be practical. So we need to, obviously, we are not allowed to transgress the mitzvah, but we need to find the loopholes that Chachamim had to begin with. They knew that we would need that. So they inserted certain loopholes to enable us to survive. And we need to use them. That's the Rav Kook approach. The Chazon Ish, on the other hand, and you will see, Be'ezrat Hashem, as we would progress in this topic, that the Chazon Ish and Rav Kook, in certain ways, they represent the two different poles about Shmitta, right? And Rav Kook is of the opinion that we need to enact Shmitta, not sell the land. On the other hand, he does want the Jewish sentiment to survive. So his approach was we should keep Shmitta, but we should maybe be a little more lenient in some of the specifics. So we would allow certain works to be done. While Rav Kook thought that we should be stringent regarding the works that are allowed to be done, but then we should be lenient in just selling the whole thing to a non-Jew, and by that, bypassing the whole mitzvah. So these are two very different approaches that we can discuss the anchorings and the benefits and the disadvantages. Each one of them, maybe we'll do that, Be'ezrat Hashem. So, but the Chazon says, mistaber, so I'm in source Vav, לפי מה שכתבתי מסתבר, שהייתה ברכה גם בבית שני וגם אחר החורבן. So he says the blessing still works. Even in the second temple, even after the destruction. Because the heavenly court, בית דין של מעלה, עושים מה שגוזרים בבית דין של מטה. So the heavenly court follow what is being decided by the earthly court. So if here on earth, the sages decided that we should have Shmitta, then God would give his bracha. And the bracha would be given after all the ishtadlut obviously was done, being all the things that we should do, we did. And how much should we do? That is according to the sages as they be me'ayin, as they learn carefully the Torah and meticulously and give the proper instructions to the people. Now, he continues to say, I do not mean that you should go into a pikuach nefesh, because obviously the Torah doesn't want you to enter into a pikuach nefesh, but short of pikuach nefesh, then yes, we should rely on the bracha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you can see the very different points of departure of Rav Kook and the Chazon Ish. And many of the outcomes would depend on these points of departure. It's just a very interesting thing to see how this dispute, the roots, where it originates. So that's basically what I wanted to do in the first half of this show. And now we enter the second half. We began very late. But well, I would ask, and I would try to do it myself. Let's try, because I do prepare this shiurim building on having a whole hour of presentation. Now, I also was late today, so it's not any finger pointing to anyone, and the people on Zoom obviously were there on time. But let's make the bother to try and be here on 9, so we would be able to begin the shiur. And otherwise, every time we are keeping a tail to next week. So, truth of the matter is, even today, I don't know if you want to enter into this discussion, because that's the second half is one integral part. You know what? We would call it a day now. It's a very short shiur. It's only half an hour, but but I don't want to begin something and then again to let's make a pledge for ourselves that Bli Neder next week, Bli Neder would begin on time. We'd begin at 9, and then we would learn what I think is an extremely important and interesting take on Shmitta, and on the question of is it a deoraita or a derabbanan, or is it a minhag, and even more important, what is the spiritual importance of Shmitta relating to our time of coming back to Eretz Yisrael? Because I don't think that Shmitta nowadays is like 300 years ago. There is a big difference, and that's something that should be, I think, discussed. That's something that should be spoken about. And Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, also known by the acronym the Natziv, I was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin in the beginning of the beginning of the 20th century. So in the end of the 19th century, there was a Shnat Shmitta in 1889. 1889 was a Shnat Shmitta. And if you know your Israeli history, you know that the Aliyah Rishona was already here. So we already had, Petach Tikva already had some of the Yishuvim beginning to be established in Eretz Israel, and they were extremely poor. It was still in the time of the Ottoman Empire. They were extremely, extremely poor. The country was run very, very bad by the Ottomans. And it was really, it was a question, would we be able to survive? Would we be able to survive? And they began, when the Shmitta was approaching, so they asked the Gdolei Ador, the giants of the Torah, of the generation, what should be done? And the Natziv was part of the discussion. It developed a part of the specifics of the detailed questions. He developed a very interesting scheme of how to see the importance of Shmitta in our time. He tied it to the Shmitta in the time of the first Shivat Zion, of the first returning to Zion, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And I think that's something that is worth considering in length. So that's what we do, Be'ezrat Hashem, next week. Thank you. Have a great week. And we would meet again next week at 9. Please God. Bye-bye.
Shavua Tov.